Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria and Eastern Antique Arms, and so I have another massive box to unbox full of antique swords. This time it's got 9, I hope, 9 antique swords in one box, and I'm just going to grab this box here. This one is really heavy. I'm going to lift it right up because it's a really super heavy box. Because there's 9 items in there, and I know these videos can get super long, I'm going to do most of the unboxing off camera, and I'm just going to hold the things up, okay, to save a bit of time. I actually just want to get this box open and see what's inside it. So I'm not going to do probably as much talking on individual things as I perhaps have done in the past. So I'll try and keep this as brief as I possibly can, even, you know, obviously by Matt Easton standards. But I hope this is interesting to a fair number of you. Obviously, if it's not, then you don't have to watch. So there's 9 items coming out of here. I think that they're all items that I will probably be selling on Eastern Antique Arms, link below. So let's have a look. Oh, see what's inside this massive box. And I'm not going to do any innuendos, because it got some complaints last time. Not proper complaints, but anyway. So let's see what's in here. And I'll come back to you in a second once I've got the first one out. So here I am with the first item. I don't know what's inside this yet. One little comment based on the previous unboxing video I did, where I complained about packing peanuts, which I said were made of polystyrene, and some people said that some of them are now made of sort of biodegradable or dissolvable in water stuff. I can confirm that the ones that I have had, and all of the ones I've ever had, are not those, unfortunately. They are polystyrene because they definitely don't dissolve in water. Anyway, let's have a little look and see what's inside here. Obviously, you can feel free to guess as I go along. Any clues? Any clues now? I bet quite a few of you can recognise it at that point. Let's have a look. Pull that label off. Yeah, so you can probably see already that this looks like 1796. And it is. That's nice, isn't it? So the 1796, such a classic saber. It's the 1796 British light cavalry saber. It's interesting actually, this is very like another one I've got, so you'll notice, just, you know, I might mention a couple of things about each sword. This one's interesting because it's got this sword knot slot at the side, which is relatively speaking unusual. Most of them have this slot, as you'll see. Try and get one off the wall without dislodging a guitar behind it. So this obviously is an officer saber, but you'll see most of them have a little slot at the bottom there. I've now got nowhere to put that sword. But there you go. Yeah, 1796, clearly been service sharpened. So this would have been used during the Napoleonic Wars. And yeah, the leather's in nice condition. All the wire wrap. That is a good sword. So that will be at some point listed on my website, or at very least it's going to be going up for sale. Right, let's move on to the next sword. Here we go, here's the next one. So again, I'm going to start at the hilt end. Interesting, sword typologies. If we look at medieval swords, they usually typologies go by the blade type, and if we go by later period swords, it usually goes by the hilts type. They each have their pluses and minuses. It's best, of course, if we can have different typologies for all the different bits, but then you end up with trying to so many different numbers and codes and stuff. Typologies, in other words, making a type, so like a type J pommel and a type 13 blade and all that kind of stuff. So you can probably guess what type of sword this is already. See if it will come out. There we go. So it is an Indian tulwar. Whoa, that is a broad blade. Oh, quite a nice big handle as well. It's all solid in the hilt, which is good. For anyone who doesn't know or hasn't seen my previous videos on these, tulwar blades are glued with the type of pitch or tar type stuff into the hilt. The advantage, it's quite secure, so long as when they get old it sometimes gets loose, but you can melt it and re-solidify it with heat, and that's how they were originally put on. one of the advantages of having that type of construction is literally you can heat the hilt up and remove the hilt if you want to put a new blade on or put a new hilt on or whatever. So I would imagine during their working lifetimes, talwars in India sometimes had, you know, a couple of changes of blade or hilt or this kind of stuff. And if you had a valuable blade, then as fashions changed with hilts, you could put different hilts on them. That is a really broad talwar, isn't it? I like that. It's not particularly long. If you just compare it to my ones on the wall, actually it's about the same, isn't it? I think it's because it's so broad, it kind of looks shorter, but that is a big beefy blade. It's got some pitting in the blade, but it's also got what looks like, a lot of old swords come to me presumably they're from houses or you know, kind of lofts and attics or wall displays in pubs and all this kind of stuff. This has got a lot of gunk on the blade which looks like it will clean off. Could it be Woots? Woots, Woots, Woots. We really want it to be Woots. I can't... It doesn't have a fuller, so there's nothing saying that it definitely wouldn't be Woots, but I can't see any signs of it being Woots. But I'm rather taken with that, actually. That's a nice talwar. I really like the when the pommel disc is tilted like this, because it makes it just a little bit more comfortable to extend the arm out like that. This is a nice talwar. I like this. Good, happy with that. Let's move on to the next sword. So here's the next thing. Again, I don't know which one. Obviously, I know the 9 swords that I purchased, but I'm not sure what's going to be in here until I unwrap it. I actually can't at all guess. I can tell that this is more or less straight. Ah, okay, I know which one this is. So this will be interesting. So look at that, gold. That is a gold pommel, very fancy. It's gilt, actually. It's not solid gold, unfortunately. It'd be wonderful if it was. Let's pull that label off. Right, this one's a little bit trickier to get out of here, so just have to do a little bit of cutting with my tea light. It looks like there's a slight bend to one of the quillons, okay, but ooh, look at this. Ha 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 ha. So you're thinking, what is that, Matt? Well, it's a type of small sword, isn't it? But this style of hilt was specifically designed for British heavy cavalry, but not to use when they were on service acting as cavalry. This was actually used, although I understand there are a couple of records of these being used on active service, but generally speaking this is their dress sword. So this is what they wore when they were in, you know, doing civic functions, mostly on foot and this kind of thing. And it's a little bit like the 1796 infantry officer's spadroon, but this is better. It has a small sword blade. I'll do a video, I think, just about this sword because it's rather interesting. So I won't talk too much about it now, but it's got an extremely interesting blade cross-section to it. And I have always maintained that it's ironic that the dress sword, the 1796 dress sword for the heavy cavalry, is functionally a better sword than the 1796 service sword for the infantry officers, which was described as the perfect encumbrance. This is a really nice sword, and the gilding, as you can probably see, let's just bring the, you can see how much gilding is remaining on that hilt. Very, very nice. Lovely, and that's called a boat shell guard because it looks a bit like a boat. Yeah, so it's kind of like a giant small sword, essentially. It's not, I wouldn't really call this a spadroon personally, I'd call this a giant small sword. It's more like a kolishmad. Very, very nice, like it a lot. Let's move on to the next sword. Here we go, here's the next one. This seems also relatively straight, much like the previous one. Oh, I think you can see hints of a 3-bar guard there. So, actually you don't have a 3, well that's kind of a 3-bar guard, the French version. I'm not entirely sure. It looks like a British 3-bar. It is a British 3-bar, so it will be either light cavalry or Royal Artillery. Probably the latter, I can't actually remember. I buy a lot of swords, obviously. Oh, okay, it's got the scabbard in there, that's good. That's, oh, bubble wrap. Oh, there we go. So, now this is interesting. I can't remember whether I've actually ever shown one of these before, but this is what's called picket weight. And you'll notice it's very narrow, so it's what you'll think of as a saber, but it's like a narrow version of one. It's almost like a spadroon blade on a saber hilt, isn't it? And it's got the winged lightning wings of the Royal Artillery, and it's got a flaming bomb and a cannon on the other side. So it's definitely Royal Artillery dress sword. But I have to say, you'll notice that at the base of the blade there, it has a brass proved disc, which means that although it is a dress sword, in theory, it's picket weight, which means dress weight. Although it's picket weight and you think it's a dress sword, it has had a proved blade. So this is, ooh, it's pretty flexy, isn't it? You can see it is a hardened and tempered spring steel blade. It's functional, and it's been tested in the same way that a sort of, battlefield sword would be. And another interesting detail is, notice there is the thumb placer is checkered, and just make the camera focus. It's checkered there. So you only bother doing that on a sword that you might use. It's where the thumb sits if you're actually using it. There's no point putting that on if you have no intention whatsoever of ever using a sword. So, and I do know of at least one record actually of an officer using a picket weight sword to kill someone when they were attacked. So it might not be your number one choice for, taking to battle, as it were, but they were intended to be functional weapons, even though they're described as picket weight or leve swords, in other words, dress swords. They are still real swords and can be used, and it essentially is a bit like a spadroon, and probably a little bit flexible for thrusting work, and probably definitely too narrow for effective cutting. But nevertheless, you could still defend yourself with it, and you could run someone through with it. It's just kind of a little bit on the dainty side, but it's a nice example of what it is, in pretty good condition. Needs a little bit of a clean, but it's got its scabbard, and that probably dates to say 1860s to 1880s, I would say. So there you go, yeah, nice example. Let's move on to the next sword. So here we've got the next one. This one feels very light, and it's quite short. So I'm not entirely 100% sure what this is, although I can see the hilt showing through the bubble wrap, so that's giving me a clue. Let's see, make sure we're not knocking the mic there, sorry. Sorry if I did. Let's tear this open, see if you can get, there we go, start to get some clues from the shape of the hilt. Try and get there. Whoa. So, this is interesting. It is like a downsized 1796 light cavalry saber. Why might it be downsized? So if I just grab the other one. So here is the normal sized one, and here is the downsized one. Okay, now why do you think we might have one that's smaller? Well, there's a few possible reasons. The hilt's a bit loose on this one. There's a few possible reasons. It could be made for a younger person, could be made for a boy who was with the cavalry regiment. Sometimes you had very young recruits who were there to be musicians or this type of thing, kind of not frontline roles. Or it could be made for a cadet troop. I know of some slightly scaled down cavalry swords that are made for cadets at school, high school age, kind of teenagers. Or it could be made for an infantry officer, and when infantry officers in the Napoleonic period started emulating cavalry swords, they often got the same kind of design scaled down. So it could be that as well. And the blade has been service sharpened extensively, and it does have little nicks in the blade. So I would imagine it's being used for drill practice. It could theoretically have been used in combat, who knows. It needs a bit of a clean up. It's sort of got some paint on it. And Unfortunately, the guard's a little bit loose because there's a leather washer which would have been there originally, which is now missing. But it's quite a nice nippy little really quick sword. It's bigger than a hanger and smaller than a cavalry saber. It's in that kind of medium range, so it'd actually make a really good fighting sword, fighting on foot for an infantry officer or something like that. Right, let's move on to the next sword. Here we go, here's the next one. Again, relatively straightish. This looks like a Victorian rifles. There we go, rifles, officer's swords. Pull that label off. Oh, the scabbard's got left behind inside the bubble wrap. So 1827 pattern hilt, 1845 pattern blade. In 1845 they switched from pipe back blades to fulled Wilkinson style blades. There we go. Still got quite a lot of its plating, nickel plating. Nickel plating came in on British Victorian swords in about the 1860s. They hadn't been able to really nickel plate things before that. And that's quite a nice example. It needs some cleaning. That's quite a nice big beefy blade actually. Retailed by Hebert and Co, which is marked on the ricasso there. That's the retailer. The maker is Pillin. So I can see from the proof disc it says proved. That's a little brass disc there. It says proved with a little P. So I can tell that the maker of this is, pretty sure that's P, yeah. The maker of this is Pillin. This has not been service sharpened, I don't think. So it could be rifle volunteers, could be regular army rifle. There's a lot of dirt on this blade, but fundamentally, actually, I don't know if you can see, but it's got frost etching, and actually the blade's in pretty damn good condition. So that should clean up really nicely, actually. There's one strand of the grip wire is loose, unfortunately. It's got a checkered back strap. And this sword probably dates to the 1880s, I would say, maybe 1870s. Good, another good example. Let's go to the next one. Here we go. So, another straight-ish sword. Probably another saber. It is obviously, inevitably, most of what I buy are British military swords because that's what's most available in the UK. It also happens to be what I'm personally most interested in. And what do we think that is? Can you see? Oh, definitely Victorian. And so, I don't know if you can see the colour difference on this, but this is not steel, this is brass. It's got the steel scabbard in there, but the hilt is brass. Brass hilt designates it as line infantry officers' sword. So the rifles one you'll notice with a steel hilt. So if you were in the rifles, you had a steel hilt. If you were in the normal infantry as an officer, you had a brass hilt. Obviously the patina of the age has made it kind of go that bronzy dark colour. Let's have a look at, whoa, that's a beefy blade. Oh, nicely service sharpened as well. Right, okay, this is actually a really, really interesting and nice sword. So, I didn't remember this being quite as special as this. So, for those of you who don't know, so first of all, it's a Wilkinson and it's numbered, so I may be able to find out who the person who purchased this sword was from the Wilkinson records, which still survive. On Eastern Antique Arms you can find links below in the resources section of how you can find that information out. But in addition to the fact that I've got the serial number on the back of the blade there, let's just see if you can see that. Get my face out of the way. There you go. See that serial number just there. As well as the fact that you've got that serial number, this one also has officers' initials on it, which are FJB. And I can narrow that down even more, that I can tell you that this sword dates to between 1892 and 1895. It has a 3-year window. Why do I know that? Well, because this style of thrusting blade only came in 1892. Okay, prior to that we had the 1845 style blade. Let's just grab the rifles one for comparison. So there we go. So the Wilkinson style 1845 blade, you'll see that it's single edged and has a fuller at the back, and then has what we call a spear point up here. And you can see it still retains a reasonable amount of breadth, about 1 inch wide, at the cutting portion of the blade up here. Whereas everything's falling over today. Whereas the other, the new blade, which came in 1892, is tapered, so it starts at 1 inch and then gets narrower, 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 narrower. So at the cutting portion of the blade, if we were to cut with it, about here, it's really quite narrow. It's only about 2/3 of an inch. So it's not really suitable for cutting. You could hit someone with it, but you're not going to cut very well with it. But it is a stiffer thrusting blade. Okay, it's got a much more tapered point, much more pointy. So it's more specialised to thrusting. Now, that blade came in 1892. They kept the old 1845 style, or 1822 in fact, style hilt, and they didn't replace the hilt until 1895. So the fact that this has the older hilt but the newer blade shows me new blade 1892. It doesn't yet have the 1895 hilt in. So the dating is 1892 to 1895. So to identify this sword, even if the Wilkinson ledger doesn't tell me who the purchaser was, I've still got their initials, FJB, and I know that FJB was in the British Infantry between 1892 and 1895. I also additionally know that this sword's been service sharpened, so there's a relatively large likelihood that they served in one of the campaigns of the late 1890s, perhaps the Boer War or something like that, or perhaps Afghanistan, could be anything, Northwest Frontier, or it could be World War I, okay, if they were in the military for quite a long time. So I look forward to finding that out. So that's a really nice sword actually, and it's got a nice narrow grip, and for this type of sword, that's a really, really nice example. Right, let's see what's next in the box. So here's the next one. I think we've been through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So have we been through 6 or 7? I'm not sure, I've lost count now. So I've either got 2 or 3 left. So again, relatively straight. This looks like a Victorian, or maybe not. Not actually sure what this one is. Ah, it's a 3-bar hilt. Ah, yes. So this is an interesting sword. Pull that label off. So I recently sold another one of these, and by pure coincidence, because these are actually pretty rare swords, and I've never owned one before until recently, and I bought one and sold it, and now I've got another one. So strange coincidence that. So it's got a folding inner section here. So it's a 3-bar hilt, like a typical light cavalry sword, but with a folding inner section, and the spring still works on this one. And a pipe-backed blade. You can see pipe-back section, just like that one behind me there. So it doesn't have a fuller, it has a sort of cylindrical section at the back of the blade, and then a long false edge or yeoman up here. And these were specifically made for either 1 or 2 regiments of Indian cavalry. And I'm not yet party to which regiments these were made for, but I understand that someone I know is doing some research into this and is onto that. So yeah, so I'll be studying to see if I can see any numbers, any regimental numbers or stuff like this on this example. But it's all solid and tight, and the spring works, and it's actually a very nice sword. These pipe backs, although they're probably not as rigid and not as strong as the fullered Wilkinson type blades, they're really nippy and really manoeuvrable for the size. They're quite light, so a good way of making quite a light blade. Anyway, so good. That's a good rare sword and a fairly decent example. It's not in fantastic condition, but they're pretty rare things. Right, good. On to the next sword. So here we are, on to the 9th and final sword. Oh, I'm sweating again. Whenever I do these unboxings, I get really, really hot in here. I think it's because I've got quite a lot of lights on to try and help you see what I'm doing. Aha! So that is a Victorian looking... Right, this is curious. So some of this guard is covered in gold paint. So at some point in its life, someone thought it was a good idea to cover it in gold paint. So I'll have to have a go at stripping some of that off. And there's the remainder. What you can see here is the remainder of a sword knot in really bad condition, unfortunately, and it's covered in gold paint, so I'll have to see if I can salvage that. Right, let's pull this off. Get rid of that. Let's just strip that label off. Right, it's funny that I was just talking about pipe backs, because I happen to recall that's exactly what this is. So this is an infantry officer's sword, but it's not the usual type I show. It is a type with a pipe back blade. Okay, so I will be making a video about these because I haven't actually, I don't think ever done one with one of these typical examples before. It's a, oh, I was going to say it's a plain blade, but it's not. It's just that the etching on it is very, very faint because it's been polished repeatedly. Ah, William, no, George IV, I think. So this is a really early one then. This is a really oh, of course it's on the hilt as well. I'm not sure if that's George IV or William IV at this stage, but so this is obviously pre-Victorian, and this is the pipe back blade again with the rod section. Hopefully you can see that clearly in the camera, with the rod section at the back instead of the fullered type of blade that came in 1845. So this is the 1822 pattern British infantry officer's sword, and I've got to say these are sometimes very light and flimsy, but this is actually quite a beefy one. This is nice. I rather like this, and it's really fine edge. One of the advantages, I often talk about the disadvantages of pipe backs, but one of the advantages is you end up with a very, very fine edge, which means you can make them supremely sharp, really razor-like. They're not the strongest blades in the world. They're not. Actually, this one's relatively stiff. Some of them are quite flexible. This one's relatively stiff and it's relatively broad. So it's actually a really nice example. I wonder if it's a Prosser. So Prosser was the maker that invented these pipe backs, and I have to say every Prosser pipe back I've ever had has been really nice. They were the kind of Wilkinson of their day. They were still around when Wilkinson started, but they were kind of fading out by that point. But before Wilkinson went into making swords, Prosser really kind of ruled the roost. So yeah, so there we go. So there was 9 swords as quickly as I could get through them. Oh, I'm sweating like a pig now. I hope that was somewhat entertaining to watch. Some of these certainly will feature in future videos, and I think most of these, or all of these, will be going up for sale at some point soon. So keep an eye on Eastern Antique Arms, link below here. Thanks for watching, folks. Cheers.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.